The 1960s ushered in the decade that really solidified television as everyone's eyes to the world. Color TV was becoming more popular. A new president who understood the power of TV, the space race, and unfortunately some pretty frightening world events. And here at home, WGAL was on top of it all. Even from its very beginning, WGAL was committed to broadcasting the news, both national and local.
We are out here in the square, downtown Lancaster, and we want to get just a sampling, a sidewalk sampling of public opinion, how some of the folks feel about the election, and let you, the viewers, know how your neighbors feel about it. Sir, how about you coming in here and joining us? Tell the folks on the other end of this, hook up your name.
Bob Schultz,
Bob?
Lancaster Street in Lancaster.
What do you do, Bob?
I work at the New Holland Machine Company.
Well, you want to move in here just a little bit more. Right. Tell us, Bob, how you feel about the election.
Well, I was at the polls about 20 minutes ago.
Dave Brandt was a remarkable guy. He taught me how to do a newscast. He said, memorize or give the first story in your own words, then you can read the rest of it, then at the end give the last story in your own words. And he said people will think you memorized it all.
The news set of the day was these little individual desks all over Studio A, and you could hardly see or hear whoever was back here.
At the time I first started here, there was a 6 o'clock newscast, an 11 o'clock newscast, and there were morning news cut-ins. And at lunchtime there was 5 minutes of news on a noon program called Noonday on 8.
Each one of the anchors produced their own segment. The regional news was encapsulated all by itself. John McElharney was the anchor, and he would produce 6-7 minutes of the local news. And Wendell Woodbury did the world news. He produced that 6-7 minutes of the world news. Back in those days, you had photographs that you put up as aids for stories from around the world.
And I remember sitting on the desk over there in that corner of the room, ready to go, and there was a guy named Bill Custer, who was the Atlantic weatherman prior to me. And as he finished the weather, he walked across the studio and he tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Bill, don't be nervous. There's probably only a couple million people watching." Just what I wanted to hear.
During the political campaigns, we had all of the top politicians of the age.
It is time that all Americans begin to think of the future of their country. Because if we don't do something about the future of the country, we may not have a future ourselves. As you know, my brother Ed went to West York High School. I remember I went out there the year after he graduated and gave a commencement address. I guess about the poorest one they ever had out there, and they probably had some pretty poor ones.
I guess you could say I was among what we call maybe the second generation of television news reporters back then. And we did learn from these pioneers who wrote the book. But there was still, television news was still evolving. It was still television was still, in the 60s, very young medium.
Sound cameras were heavy and hard to carry. They were not very portable. And given the fact that cameras were not portable, most of what was shot on silent film.
We always did reporting, even when I was doing weather. I, for example, would go to Reading every day for a long period of time and be expected to come back with 3 or 4 stories, edit those stories, write those stories, get them on the air for 6 o'clock, and somehow get a 6 o'clock weather show together too.
There were people who were making the decisions. The people who were in charge were not afraid to listen to the reporters. Okay. Get the story. Do what you have to do to get the story. But get it right. Get it right.
The biggest story I ever covered was the Agnes flood. And I really mean that. Of all the stories, I've often been asked that question, often thought about that. And the Agnes flood affected more people than any other story that came along. I mean, 3 Mile Island had all the drama, but nothing impacted people like the Agnes flood. I mean, people lost relatives. People had friends who drowned. People lost their homes. It impacted the people of this area more than anything that ever happened.
And Gene was right in the middle of it. Gene was a couple of blocks from here on a bridge that goes across the Conestoga, and he had one of those old VW vans. And he had all his equipment and radios and everything else in there. And he's coming across the bridge, and the van started to float. and it's going from one side, banging into the guardrail, the other side, and he just kept the wheels churning, made it across, came back to the station, forget the van, got his film processed and got a story on the air.
The way we reported on those stories, I think, when you look back, those were WGAL's finest hours when it came to fulfilling the commitment of reporting news to our viewers.
I am so proud to have worked with all these people. Of course, a big part of the news is the weather, and I'll bet that not many of you remember that I used to do the weather. And let me tell you that forecasting and delivering the weather has really changed over the years. Weathermen and women used to draw with magic markers and move little magnets around on a map and get information from the National Weather Wire services. Not always the most accurate.
D-Bang was our first weather person, and I was her relief. That's how I started doing the weather. And eventually I filled in for every weather show there was.
I was fortunate enough to get the Atlantic Weatherman shot, which was, I think, one of the plums here at the station. Everybody wanted to do it. You worked for an advertising agency and for the Atlantic Refining Company, and it was sort of like big time. It was a nice feeling.
Well, I think back in the 60s and 50s, the National Weather Service was pretty much the exclusive provider of weather in this country.
Oh boy, I'll tell you, when I started doing weather in this studio, in fact, still behind one of the blue chroma key walls was the magnetic metal map, the painted metal wall that you would stick the magnets onto. It was still in the studio, even though we'd obviously gone all computer at that time.
I'm not sure when Joe Calhoun started here at the station, but I know it was shortly after he began here. He came up to the art department and he asked me if I would draw Calhoun's Kids.
Well, Calhoun's Kids was developed years ago when back in Omaha, Nebraska. My wife is a teacher. She thought it was a neat idea to have kids dress appropriately for the weather for that school day.
And he showed me some that he had in color when he was on a Nebraska TV station. And I looked at them and I said, yes, I think I can do this for you.
And we have, I don't know, umpteen versions of Calhoun's Kids in the computer now. WGAL has always given me all the toys I've needed and to have fun in forecasting the weather. That's why I tell people all the time, I'm on TV because I want to forecast the weather. I don't forecast the weather so I can be on TV, and I think there's a distinction there. And they've allowed us to be meteorologists first and then TV broadcasters second. We develop the information and then we deliver that information. And we've always had the best equipment and the best information that money could buy.
When we return, we'll take a look at how WGAL defined the Susquehanna Valley, forever changed news coverage, and introduced you to some folks that have become an everyday part of your lives. Stay with us.